around, because you are horsey people, but you're not those mad horsey people that you get. You're people who actually are really thinking about how we can improve the lives of horses through applying a much more scientific lens to what we do. So I think it's great that we're all here and that we're all somewhat on the same page most of the time. And that we've got a fantastic programme of talks today and a great organising committee who've really kept us to time, and it might go horribly wrong from here on in. Oh, no, it's not. Nick's with us now. Would you like to wave to the crowd, Nic, just to make sure that we know you're with us and you can hear me? No? No, we've lost them already. I know this is going to be a great morning. But don't worry, I've told everybody that I've got a song and dance routine. I've got a song and dance routine, Nic, ready, just in case it all goes horribly wrong. So if you want to see the song and dance routine, then make it go horribly wrong. And then I'll get a few volunteers up here.
That's a challenge.
Oh, yeah. So can we just test your sound, please, just to make sure that everybody can hear you before I introduce you. So would you like to say hello to me?
Right.
Now you've got me. Is it ready? Okay, Nic, are you there with us?
I am here.
Excellent, excellent. Don't start yet, because I've got to introduce you. So Katrina's on sound, but no, shut up a minute. Right, first of all, let's just test your sound. So if you could just say hello to me.
Hello, Nat. How are you?
Fine. Does everybody hear that okay?
Yes.
Yeah, good. So I'm going to introduce you, Nic, and then the way this is going to work, apparently, is that you will go through your talk. There will be a 5-minute warning, which I will be signalled, so I'm going to keep my eye out. At that point, I will signal to you, and if that means interrupting you, I will. And
Fair enough.
And then we'll finish, and there will be questions. And if you can't hear the questions from the floor, then I'll repeat them to you. And then hopefully we'll all be tickety-boo, and we'll have a great time.
Okay, are we starting now, or can I just go and close the doors to the rooms and make sure no one barges in?
You go and shut the doors, and I'll introduce you. Well, you would have done that by now. Okay, so this, as you can see, is Dr. Nic de Brauwere, and he is a graduate from a vet school in South Africa. He has been working at Redwings Horse Sanctuary in the UK in various positions, but he's now head of welfare and behaviour and closing the doors. And he's also the chair, and has been for some time, of the UK National Equine Welfare Council that brings together most of the equine welfare organisations in the UK, which is fantastic because they get on the same page as each other and produce some really good guidelines and things. So those of you who are interested should try and catch up with Nic at some other point, not now because he's not here. That is all I have to say about Nic. Nic is a fantastic guy, and it's such a shame that he's not with us, because if you don't know him, he wears very brightly coloured shirts and dances like a madman, and does like the odd glass of alcohol, not too much though, of course. And so it's a shame that he's not here. I gather he's not here because he has a criminal record, and Canada wasn't ready for him. But it could have been the bright shirts that they weren't ready. So I don't know what he's doing. I think he's ironing the bright shirts at the moment, just so he can wear it for you. But anyway, he has a lot of doors in this cottage that he's in. And he's back. That's good. I'll just let him catch his breath from all the running around and shutting the doors that he's been doing.
I'm here.
Okay, Nic, you are suitably introduced. So please, when you're ready, if you would like to start, and welcome.
Thank you very much, Nat, and to ICs and the organising committee, and to Katrina in particular, and apologies that my own behaviour change wasn't adequate to ensure that I could actually be there with all of you today. So what I'd like to do is just cover the opportunities that I see for equitation science into the future, and I'm going to do that just by picking up from where Cami left off yesterday with her excellent introduction to where we are now and how we've got here. I'd like to talk a little bit about making an impact so that we can achieve the lasting change we're all aspiring to. And to do that, I want to just have a bit of a refresher about what we mean about welfare, and then talk through some of the concepts around human behaviour change, the barriers to change, and hopefully end with an optimistic note of the perfect future. So just a little bit about myself and where I'm from. I work at the Humane Society or charity called Redwings Horse Sanctuary. It's the largest horse sanctuary in the UK. Founded in 1984, we've got 11 farms across the UK. On a daily basis, look after over 1,500 horses, and we have about 400 to 500 horses out on loan. We respond directly to welfare complaints from the public, but also working with other organisations, and that's taken us into the realm of working on cruelty cases and trying to help horses in need that are difficult to catch, so the ferals and the fearful horses. The horses all come to us through our quarantine and assessment yards, where we try and get their physical health back on track, but also assess their behaviour. And we have a veterinary hospital where there's 8 vets, including myself, 5 of which focus on the in-house horses, and 3 of us focus on the problems on the outside. Interestingly, the in-house vets are less keen on the difficult behaviour horses until we fix them, and that led us to the creation of our behaviour centre, where we retrain the feral horses and try and undo the problem behaviours. And over the years, through ICs and meeting the various people that created ICs and are part of ICs now, we have committed really strongly to try to develop an ethical and evidence-based approach to our training of horses. Rehoming obviously gives us the ability to move horses out there. I think it's an educational opportunity and also gives us some space. And very importantly, we've become very keen on the education and campaign side of our work in order to try and prevent some of the welfare problems that we've seen over the years. So how can we make an impact? I think to date one could summarise the equitation science community at ICs as having created an awareness of behaviour and probably given it the legitimacy that I think behaviour in particular hasn't received in all parts of the horse world, whether that's the veterinary or the horse users. I think we've shown that behaviour has a role to play in horse training, and I think the concept of learning theory has started to gain some kind of traction as being a real thing. I think we've also, IC certainly has addressed important welfare issues related to horse training, and it's extended its reach to integrate that sort of understanding that it's not just the 1 hour in the saddle that matters to the horse, and that there's a fundamental importance of the rest of the horse's 23 hours of its life. So what impact do we want to make into the future? And here I'm going to draw on the change that I think we want to see. If we read the IC's mission, that we really want to see the people who control horses, their welfare, change their behaviour towards their horses. And this would not only improve horse welfare, but hopefully also that horse-rider relationship. But the question really is, how do we know if we've made that impact? I think there's probably an opportunity for us to review what ICs and equitation scientists have done, and I think we should do that for each piece of research as well as the wider movement. We should find out why it worked, if it didn't work, why it didn't work, how we got there. But I think the important question we should ask is whether or not this is a role for ICs or whether it's actually down to the members. There's always going to be resistance to change, and we keep asking ourselves, I think, why does knowledge not change behaviour? Because it seems to be that there is resistance to change even when we have really good unequivocal evidence that a particular behaviour is bad. And one just has to look at human obesity, equine obesity, tight nose bands. All of these issues are well evidenced, and yet even when one offers alternatives such as the training that Andrew and McLean offer, the various practitioners around the country and the world now that can give people the tools to change what they want to do, we still aren't necessarily having the reach and the impact that we could. So for equitation scientists to achieve change, the first thing is we need to make sure that equitation scientists remain and are great scientists. but actually they probably also need to develop skills, knowledge, and have the time to understand humans and affect human behaviour change. Otherwise, how are they going to insert or apply their scientific findings into daily practice, which is, of course, the theme of this conference. So I think that reputation scientists will need to lead the change that we want to see. And for that, we need to be motivated so that we can ensure that our research enters into common use. But honestly, are reputation scientists necessarily primarily interested in the application of their science? And even when we are, do we have the skills and do we have the time to actually do that work? I'm going to just spend a bit of time talking about welfare, given it's at the heart of our discussions and the motivator for most of what we do. And really, I just want to be sure that for people who have maybe spent some time to think about it, that it's just an assumed knowledge about what welfare is, that we can maybe just break it down into more objective stages, which will help us maybe in the future with our application of our research. So, what is welfare? It is actually quite simply how well an animal is coping, and it can be coping positively or poorly. So ultimately, welfare boils down to what the animal is experiencing, and this is not necessarily the same as the care being given, and I think this is the change in understanding about welfare that is so important for us to achieve in the horse-owning public and in the industry as a whole. So there are different ways that we can determine what the horse's experience is, but in practical terms, for domesticated equines, welfare is directly linked to what humans either do for them or to them, as in this video, or don't do for them or to them. And then, when welfare is poor, we tend to look at it in terms of duration and severity. The legislation that we have around the world on animal welfare tends to focus on avoiding bad welfare. If we're going to do that, we have to understand the different ways in which bad welfare might affect animals. And traditionally this has been done through an assessment of health. And this is fairly obvious because, of course, health is something that we can measure and therefore is quite an easy one for us to become more objective about. But isn't there more to welfare? We have to now start discussing emotional states, given that fear and distress has never been something that anyone has argued against when we've talked about suffering of animals. But we can also talk about comfort and security. If the FEI can talk about the happy athlete, maybe we need to talk about it too. And so the concepts of comfort, pleasure, interest, confidence, sense of control are all things that we need to include in our discussion on welfare. This allows us to move into a few discussions around the models of 5 freedoms, the welfare needs, and the 5 domains, and we'll come on to that in a second. And probably just like you to think about the concept of anthropomorphism, and I think some of the talks later on today, particularly from Natalie and Hayley, will actually get us thinking more about anthropomorphism and whether or not it could be good or bad for animal welfare. Because we need to really start thinking about this aspect of sentience. Which is really, it's our ability to perceive our environment and to experience negative and positive sensations. And so we are now really at that point where we can not only believe that sentience exists, but evidence it quite strongly. But we still need to ask ourselves, how do we really know if animals are feeling positive experiences or negative ones for that matter? And I'll refer you back again to the talk that Hayley and Natalie will be doing later on today. So how do we assess welfare in the UK? Well, the law really relies on describing welfare here in terms of the five needs, and that we have a duty to ensure welfare. The legislation turns scientific interpretations into rules and consequences, so it's really ultimately down to a society to dictate what animal welfare legislation can and can't achieve. I'm just going to very briefly show you the way that the law works in the UK. I think what's important here is that the legislation in the UK, New Zealand, other parts of the world is generally becoming much more dynamic. And even when you don't have access to this legislation in your own country, I think this approach allows us to actually have much more of an impact in terms of not only dealing with cases of suffering, but also allows us to prevent things that we can see are going to go wrong if we don't intervene. So unnecessary suffering in the UK is really when someone has gone too far and the animal has suffered and it has been without any justification. But we also talk about the potential for animals to suffer if things do not change or improve. Under unnecessary suffering, you normally have the actions that follow directly, which is that we seize the animals, remove them, and prosecute. And the prosecution is taken forward either by police or local authorities or by the RSPCA. But the point is, it's ultimately the courts that make the decision on whether somebody is guilty or not of having committed an offence. And even when they are found guilty, it's possible that the sentencing and the sanctions may not have a huge impact on human behaviour. And we've even seen situations where horses are returned to the perpetrator after a guilty verdict. Only, however, about 1% of all the complaints that come to the RSPCA in 2016 ended up at the seizure and prosecution stage. And so, of the complaints that came into the RSPCA, about half of them ended up needing investigating, and the vast majority that responded to people being given advice or being put under some kind of pressure, whether that's a warning notice or a threat of further action, which allowed most of these situations to actually be resolved. And this is actually often done in light and balance against the fact that nearly every case that goes to court for prosecution through the RSPCA is actually successful in terms of a guilty verdict, which helps us with that motivation perhaps on people to respond to the pressures to do things rather than face the alternatives. But really, is the law fully capable of ensuring that we are going to get rid of poor welfare and encourage positive welfare states? So, if we have a look at this video, we have a horse here that's being kept perfectly legally and is in good health. But is it actually enjoying good welfare, and is it potentially even suffering poor welfare? And I think for all of us, it's fairly obvious to say that this horse is showing clear signs of distress. So, another thing that we need to consider when we talk about welfare is that there's a perception around welfare. It's a potentially toxic term because it's associated with enforcement and interference in people's ability to carry on doing what they want to do with their horses. However, welfare should really be the foundation of all the care and use we have for our horses. And in the practical sessions, you're going to actually talk through some of the benefits and the opportunities that the Code of Practice for Welfare in Canada offers. And I think that'll be a great opportunity to see how maybe one can use codes of practice and that sort of pre-suffering stage to encourage better welfare, not just absence of negative, but maybe presence of positive. And this brings me to the discussion of the 5 domains model. So I think it's really important that we recognise that the 5 domains model is a model rather than a description of animal welfare. And it's described as being a focusing device. What it does is it actually brings into the discussion the basically the impacts of sentience and talks about the affective states, emotional states that animals can experience, and it introduces the fact that there's negative and positives of each situation an animal might find itself in. So I think this is an important part of the evolution of our objective approach to animal welfare and incorporating those emotional experiences and states. So what we need to do now is also look at this and see whether or not we can get some progress from this model and actually use it in a practical way, for example, by coming up with provisions. I could really strongly encourage you guys to get hold of a copy of this 5 domains model, which is accessible through open access through the journal it was published in, and it is made freely available on all of the websites. I'm not sure how clearly you'll be able to see the finer print, but I think what's really important here is that it actually breaks down into not only the factors that we've already looked at, the physical factors that we can measure, but we're also starting to include the conversation about what the behaviour means, and interpreting that behaviour not only in terms of whether it's positive or negative, but whether or not it actually relates to the experience that the animal is enjoying or not enjoying. However, it's possible that you could look at that and find it a fairly inaccessible, too abstract and too detailed. And actually, I can highly commend the work done by the Horses and People and Christina and her work for being part of the other component of change, which is communicating science effectively. I've split this into 2 slides really just to try and make sure that some of it's legible. But what's really important here is that not only has it adapted the 5 domains table on the previous slides, but it's actually made it much more accessible as not only a visual thing, but also bringing into play this importance of the interaction between people and their horses. And I think what's really skillful in this particular poster is that it taps into the emotional reasons why people have their horses, and they desire all the time to have that emotional link and probably interpret what their horse is doing through an emotional lens. So, how are we going to improve horse welfare, given that we have basically touched on the human component already? So I'm just going to sort of throw in here this term Anthropocene, and this is really where we are now claiming to live in a geological age which is entirely governed by the influence of humans. So really one could say there's no such thing anymore as a wild horse. And this photograph shows some feral horses that are left to live wild, but in fact their environment is controlled by boundaries. And last year there was a terrible drought which nearly led to the death of a number of horses until humans actually intervened to provide a potable source of water for about 2.5 weeks. So humans are basically entirely responsible for the welfare of the horses on this globe. And so it really does not just involve 1 hour in saddle and the 23 hours in the stable or in the paddock, but actually it's all 24 hours. And this brings us to the rest of the discussion, which is really all about people. So if we want people to change their attitudes and their behaviours towards horses, we really need to understand them. But we need to really understand all of these components together. So it's not just the people, it's not just the horses, but we need to understand the industries, the sort of relationships between those three. And so, arguably, 3 things overlap and certainly influence each other, but maybe they also compete with each other. And I sort of comes the attempts of PowerPoint, but what I'm trying to show here really is that it actually can get quite messy for the horse in terms of all the factors that can influence its welfare. And we really need to also start discussing how the social segments of the human's life is a fundamental part of the welfare of the horses into the future. So even better, someone let me use with a crayon. I'm just trying to sort of cut a diagram which maybe shows a little bit some of the complexities that we need to consider when it comes to bringing about change that's meant to influence the horse in a positive way. So we tend to come up with stuff being a problem and then linking it back to the owners and get frustrated when we don't see changes in the owner's behaviour. So they are the target for our change, but sometimes they also feel like the victim. If you're being targeted, that actually brings out all of the human qualities which make people much less inclined to change. We also need to consider the people who are activists and advocates, and I include myself in that group, but we could also consider the more radical elements who call for banning of activities, and whether or not their influence is actually a positive or constructive one. But ultimately, and Julie Feely will talk about this today as well, through an institutional lens, but actually very important, is for us to consider who is the voice for the horse, and is it just as simple as a single person who can speak for the horse? I think what we really need to start doing is considering how we can research not just the problem that we've identified, but actually getting a better understanding of whether or not there is a problem, or as Kathy said yesterday, whether there's a perception that there's a problem in the first place. And that can lead us to do further research into both of these components or alongside each other, so that we can find solutions. And then we need to engage stakeholders to achieve those solutions being put into practice to ultimately have the owners change their behaviour. And ultimately, I think all the time we need to keep coming back to this thing of where is the perception of the problem and who agrees that we have a problem in the first place. So some of the questions I think we should ask ourselves about the people who want to influence to change their behaviour to their horses is really trying to get under the skin. Why do they have their horses? Is it something that they do to relax? Is it important for their social life, their connection with other people? Is it a status thing? Is it how they make their income, their livelihood? And importantly, is welfare one of their values? And if it is, how do they frame it? How do they describe what they perceive as the welfare of their horse? So if we're going to ask people to change, we need to be mindful that we're probably going to be challenging their identity, which is linked into money, financial security, income derived from their activities, their view in society, their status and prestige, Their awareness or not, and this I think is important to talk about not just individuals here, but also organisations, whether it's the FEI or a governing body in a country, or even governments themselves, to understand what the public perceptions are of their activities. And then to understand that if we are going to question those activities, that we are effectively threatening them, and that gives people the feeling of loss and the fear of change. And perhaps one of the most dangerous things we can do is to be a direct threat to people's beliefs and values, either directly or indirectly through challenging their practices. So further challenges to change, and this is where I'm going to find myself a little bit at a loss because I'm certainly no expert on human behaviour and psychology. But I think we need to really understand the challenges from a human psychology point of view. So when we talk about cognitive bias, we're talking here about that sort of difficulty for people to sort of apply their beliefs, their values and their behaviours in a sense that's linked to evidence and fact. And people will, for example, there's a whole bunch of different cognitive biases, one of which is confirmation bias, where we tend to seek out the information that will confirm what we believe, and even where belief bias, where effectively we will tend to look at something and evidence and judge the evidence whether or not it actually, the findings of that evidence support our belief or don't. When we challenge people, they experience what we describe as cognitive dissonance, which is a really uncomfortable feeling of being confronted with evidence that challenges your beliefs. And generally what happens in those situations is that people withdraw deeper into their beliefs. If you add into that the Dunning-Kruger effect, which in a sense says that the more experience they have, the more you are mindful of the fact that you don't know everything. So often people are the most confident. And so actually challenging people at that stage can be very difficult. However, if we're just going to rely on that, we're going to struggle to achieve any change. And I think if we look at people who are very positive about horse welfare, and recently I saw some quotes in relation to things happening on the internet in relation to rule changes, challenges to the API's approach to endurance, all of these things, you see that the people who are actually in favour of improving horse welfare go through the same stages of challenges to change and also run on their beliefs. They can convert to a guru, so instead of believing somebody who gets things wrong, will believe somebody who gets things right, but will not actually have that opportunity to be critical about what they're doing. And we really need to be constantly mindful of the fact that our personal experiences and observations, as well as social pressures, put a lot more influence on how people behave in future. And I think one of the things that I'm finding I'm saying quite a lot to people is that correlation doesn't equal causation, whether we talk about turmeric or strangles. So, HBC, what is it, human behaviour change? Well, actually, there's been a lot of work done on trying to understand humans and their behaviour from all sorts of reasons, to improve education, standards of education, to tackle human health problems. And I think what we need to try and understand is that there's a whole range of things out there. If you just start Googling human behaviour change, you can get overwhelmed with things that will take you down all sorts of tunnels, fascinating tunnels and really exciting stuff. But actually, we need to sort of come back to the basics of what is the theory behind changing people's behaviours, and we'll touch briefly on the COMB and trans-theoretical models, and then talk about approaches, whether that's the Human Behaviour Change for Animals Foundation, the Behavioural Insights team, a project called Reset in Europe, and to understand maybe things like social marketing, where people like TAP and French have written and offered really good presentations online about how marketing can be used for social good. And I just pointed to these two folks here about, I think, what often motivates people who want to bring about human behaviour change for societal improvements. The first one I think was Confucius who said it, so it's been around for a while. And it really involves this whole concept of engaging with the people who want to influence rather than just talking at them. And this, I think, is probably equally important, is to understand that actually if we want to get people to change, we need to tap into their emotional connection to the whole thing. And this is one of the reasons why facts do not of themselves achieve a change. So just talking a little bit about the theory of change. So the trans-theoretical model was proposed by Proshka de Clemente a few years ago. This is often represented as a circle. I think what's important is that quite often we are faced with people who aren't even aware that there's a potential need for change in their behaviour. Often then when people start to see things that catch their attention and they start to investigate, they will think about the need to change. So once you've seen enough adverts about smoking and alcohol abuse, you might start thinking about how often you take a cigarette or a drink, but actually preparing to change and actually getting to that stage of doing something about it can be quite a long process, and often we lose people in this stage of the process. Once people have made that sort of commitment to change, then they need to act on it. And this is, I think, a critical part where we need to facilitate that process. And quite importantly, often people will get to that maintenance stage and the early maintenance of new habits that can still relapse. And I think it's important to recognise that if we aren't actively involved in our project and constantly reviewing it, we may lose people to the sort of changed behaviour early on. And I'll come up with a couple of examples of that in a moment. I think we need to also recognise that change is an ongoing process. So often we need to be grateful for small changes, and I think progress over perfection, Lisa's phrase, and Cammy used it yesterday, is a vital part of us taking ourselves on that journey to the ultimate goal of perfection. The common beat system is a further sort of helpful tool to understand the things that need to be in place in order to achieve a change of behaviour. So people need to have that capability to change. So that's not just psychological, have they thought about it, have they committed to it, but can they make the change to their behaviour? Are they motivated enough to change? And finally, do they have opportunities? And each time we have these, there's going to be positive opportunities as well as barriers that could maybe make that change more difficult. So we need to have these three things in place, and they also need to be functioning together in order to get the change in the behaviour that we want to see. So tactics to bring about change. It's not always as simple as running some horses down a narrow lane, and a lot of people don't cope particularly well with being chased or forced to move. I'm going to steer clear of the sort of discussions about the FEI. I think we'll have enough of those over a glass of wine at some point. But I thought this was a very interesting sort of component that came up through my work working with the Gypsies and Travellers at Appleby Horse Fair. So this had nothing to do with animals, but had to do with the persecution that was felt by the Gypsy and Traveller community in relation to changes in the legislation about their permission to stop in places and to actually have somewhere to stay overnight. And it got to the point where actually they organised themselves into a march which actually made quite an impact. And I think we need to look at this when we also, certainly I'm hearing people say this sort of thing within the thoroughbred industry and within the sort of sporting industries, that they feel like they're being victimised and they love their horses passionately. And why are they the ones that are coming under the sort of the pressure to change? And certainly sometimes they turn on their governing bodies rather than sort of understanding what the challenges are to what they're doing, and actually start blaming their governing bodies for not supporting them against the voices of the activists. When we don't see the change that we want, I think it's also very important to be very methodical in how we look at it. And the Brook is a fantastic organisation, Cammy again mentioned them yesterday, who have taken human behaviour change to heart and really incorporated it into everything that they do with their international projects. And they saw that the farriers working in 2 regions in India were not achieving the skills and the competencies of high-quality farrier that they had been trained to do through the projects that the Brook had initiated. And they basically undertook a study to try and work out what was going wrong with their project. And they found that there were competing priorities for the farriers and that there were factors that influenced the quality of the farrier services that are not only external to the farrier, but very much reliant on the context in which the farriers work. So the 2 different regions had very different outcomes and very different reasons why the farrier wasn't happening the way it should. And one of the most important things they understood from this was that the owners didn't really want high-quality farriery, and so the Brook needed to realign their sort of projects in order to focus on the demand rather than just on upskilling the farriers. And this is an open access paper, if anyone wants to have a look at that, a great example of a reflection on a project that didn't go according to plan. So, what are people's motivations to change? I think we need to understand that, and that's the point I've just made about understanding why the owners didn't want high quality farrier. It's a vital part of this undertaking any project to bring about change. Communication is therefore a really important part of this whole process. We need to engage with the people who we want to influence. Beyond just trying to understand them, I think we need to also encourage curiosity. We need to engage in our communication in a way that doesn't imply or carry any judgment, And we need to collaborate not just with the people who want to influence, but also with professional science communicators. I refer you again to the excellent work that's done on communicating ICs, Horses and People, the Horse Magazine, the journalists who come to the conference, who really don't seem to have an agenda other than to communicate effectively what the science is trying to say. And just a little example here, this pony is on a new system of grazing, and the rest of the herd is standing watching, trying to figure out how they can get to the grass. But limitations of visual communication mean that he couldn't explain to them they need to go to the bottom corner of the field and just turn into that lane before they get to the new grass. So when we talk about communication and projects, we need to also talk about collaborating. And I think it's important that we don't have to necessarily understand everything about how other people and other sectors and other disciplines work. And we also don't necessarily need to like the people that we need to work with in order to achieve change. But what's really important is that we have a fundamental assumption and build a true trust and respect between the people who are going to collaborate. So for me, collaboration is everything from a process of co-creation, where you work together on a joint value that you want to achieve. So this is now sort of definitions coming from a company context, but really this is linked to everything from social enterprise to the work that equitation scientists are trying to do. And I think it's really important that we look at operating not just cross-sector. You only have to look at, and I think we'll learn tomorrow very much how we can learn from training horses using positive reinforcement that's been the norm in new animal training and wild animal training for years, and is really gaining traction in the canine world, as well as working in the human field. So, for example, the studies that look into humans' ability to change or not change their habits in relation to their own health. And then also look at different disciplines, everything that ICES is already doing, combining biomechanics, behavior, and also incorporating, and again, ICES I think needs to be commended for embracing social science and research that's not just objective research, but also observational and so on. So when we look at the theory of change, we also need to sort of understand that there will be different people out there offering either commercial or non-commercial models that we can tap into. So the Behavioural Insights team was set up in the government in the UK. There's now a global business that offers at a fee a model and a process that can help people change. And they really should be somebody you should at least go look at their free resources, because it does really adequately illustrate how they use the nudge theory of change to increase positive behaviours they're seeking to achieve and decreasing positive negative behaviours they're trying to avoid. But also, there was a project, and if you try to Google reset, it just doesn't come up. It's a very small project in terms of global reach. But this is again taking the theory behind people's ability to change and turning it into a model. This was focused specifically on trying to improve the use of antibiotics in dairy cows in Holland and other parts of Europe. And it was really focused not only on farmers to reduce the unnecessary use of antibiotics, but also on the veterinarians who are prescribing it. And it understood that it was really important to combine everything from rules of enforcement, so there's threat of punishment, offering people knowledge, but also tapping into the fact that their inclination to change is more likely to come from an emotional point, as well as perhaps providing positive reinforcement of economic opportunities as well as disincentives, and then making sure that they have that facilitation. And I think this is an area we need to keep discussing, is what is our role as facilitators? And if we are the right people to facilitate the change, we need to tap into and cooperate and collaborate with people who are skilled facilitators. And I'm just going to offer to you here a group who is set up specifically, and we learned about them in Wagga in 2017, who have all worked in the sphere of human behaviour change, predominantly from the animal welfare and the global animal welfare sector. And they now offer a range of education and training for us to get upskilled in human behaviour change projects, but will also help us design and take projects forward. So just very briefly, looking at the Behavioural Insights team, this is just a sort of extract of some of the information that they make available to people that are interested in engaging with their services. So I think they already understand the fact that getting people to change their behaviour is not the same as changing their intentions, beliefs or attitudes. They often aren't going to succeed in doing that, and this is very important when you're addressing and focusing adults. The Other thing that I think that is important to sort of look at this is that they actually work in a very systematic way. So they start very much at the beginning on understanding what is the outcome their client wants to achieve. And quite often they work with governments who want to improve response to fines, increase in providing information to the census, that sort of thing. And then they work very hard to understand the context in which this change, this outcome is being desired. And ultimately then they'll design an intervention after doing a range of research using that EAST framework. And I'm just going to pick back to that because I think the sort of fundamentals of their project is that they look at all of their interventions to make sure that they are easy for the target person to do, they're attractive for them to do, they have a social benefit, and that the intervention is timed at that moment where it's most likely to succeed. And ultimately they are very focused on testing and adapting according to what they find out from perhaps pilot studies and certainly ongoing monitoring of their projects. So where does equitation science fit into this behaviour change of animals that we want to see? Well, as we said earlier, all horses are basically influenced by the humans on this planet, but given that most people will keep horses for the purpose of riding and using them in some way, I think it's really important that we do use this term equitation science rather than just equine science. And yes, it might be that evidence alone isn't going to change the behaviours, but it's also fundamentally important to recognise that if we don't properly research the problem, i.e. what is the animal problem, the horse problem, the behavioural problem that we've anticipated, the tight nose bands, rein tension, the balance of the rider, the need of horses to have sleep. If you don't actually properly investigate those, if you don't understand the impact they have on horse welfare, we can't really then demonstrate and support the change that we want to see. I think it's also really important that we maintain the integrity of the science. So the science needs to not only be of high quality in terms of statistical significance, but I think it also needs to be drafted, drawn up, and created and carried out in a way that is respected. So the process of peer review, for example, is absolutely integral to successfully putting our science out there as something that we can offer people as part of this process. I think it's also really important, and this is a really difficult thing when you put your life's work into a research project, that if the results don't give you that result that you wanted, that you're hoping for, that we need to be honest about the interpretation of our findings, the discussions, and actually make that science useful to other people to come and work on rather than trying to put forward. And I think we can all think of examples where science has been corrupted by people trying to actually achieve personal gain, whether that's, for example, the science allegedly that led to the anti-vaxxer movement gaining traction, climate deniers. Often you can link that back to fairly dodgy science. And I think it's really important, and we touched on this earlier, that we communicate our science honestly. We need to make it accessible to the people. We need to try and make sure that our science is understood by the audience that we're trying to influence, but it doesn't need to lose that integrity and honesty. And I think the first thing we can do is probably dismiss the headlines of any newspaper that we see that claims that it's a scientific breakthrough, which rather, I think, prefer you to magazines like Horses and People and The Horse, and the outputs of ICE, for example, putting all of our science online, our position statements, as a much better place to signpost people to if they want to understand the science behind what they see. And ultimately, if the science has good integrity, then it has every opportunity of being applied, but we also need to again go back to that concept of collaboration, working with people. I keep coming back to examples like Andrew and Manuela McLean, but there's obviously a whole host of other people out there now who know how to apply the science in a way that can actually bring meaning to the owners of the horses. So just going to very briefly then touch on a couple of projects that show not only the successes that we can hopefully achieve, but also some of the challenges. So Redwings embarked on a principle of trying to ensure that the experience of every one of the 15 to 1600 horses under our care would have similar experiences when they are handled by any one of our staff across the whole organisation. And in order to do that, we felt that we needed to apply learning theory and come up with methods of training our staff to train the horses and to handle the horses so that we could ensure that that consistency would happen across the organisation. So we not only have an induction where people join the organisation, we explain to them the concepts behind why we do what we do, and then give them some examples. So we say to them, look, This is why we put head collars on in a certain way, and here's a couple of different ways that we ask you to do it. This is why we lead horses in a certain way, and this is how you can do it. So we try and make it as easy as possible. We also then want our young horses that come into the sanctuary, the ones that are born at the sanctuary, to have a good foundation in life. So we came up with the Redwings horse training program. In 2016, we trained 32 members of staff that identified themselves as having an interest in doing this work. And in 2017, we added another 13 people to that and gave a refresher course to 17 people. And in 2018, we brought 14 new people on, and we gave another 22 people refresher training. And this was primarily on not only making our horses safe to handle and giving them a positive experience in terms of their handling and they had to be wormed or have their feet trimmed, but also to prepare them for the ground, in other words, to do the groundwork, the in-hand training, so that those horses that could potentially go forward for under saddle work would have had the best possible start. But the project hasn't quite gone as swimmingly as we hoped. So our teams that have come on these courses and the people across the organisations from the feedback we get from internal seminars are fully enthused and engaged in this process, in this project. However, what we found is when we watch how these people handle and train horses after they've had their initial training, their confidence after the training tends to wane and their ability seems to struggle a bit. As a result of that, their confidence drops. And we've got a system of mentoring in place in order to support these guys when they are doing their training. But one of the big challenges that we've got is that generally our colleagues are under pressure to do the basic husbandry, and the time that they've had to practice hasn't been given to them as often as we've needed to. And we've had two negative experiences for consequences of that. The first one is that actually we haven't had as many horses trained the way we want, so we haven't had that progression of horses being ready to go to rehoming, and horses that are coping more happily with having their feet trimmed, for example. But we've also sensed and seen a real sense of frustration in the people that we've trained because they know that they should do better. They are aware now of the difference that they could make, but they don't know how to get there. And so part of our internal project is to actually review that and come up with different ways, which would include probably providing a simpler training structure maybe, or maybe changing the focus on getting the guys to really look at the impact of their training on the horses rather than diligently following all of the steps. Whilst I say that, we have actually seen really good progress in a number of our colleagues and in general also having a better time as a result of this project, but it certainly hasn't gone as fast and as thoroughly as we would like it to. So a different project, but one that I just wanted to touch on, it's focused on health. But this project was started from the very outset using a commitment to the principles of human behaviour change. My team, my colleagues Andy and Helen in the team next door, basically started this process very much after having undertaken some human behaviour change training. So the first thing that we did is we attempted to understand the people that we were trying to influence because we wanted to try and get increased biosecurity, in particular in relation to strangles in the general horse owning public in the UK. So we did a survey which actually had a huge uptake and gave us a lot of information which we had made assumptions about and actually had a lot of those assumptions challenged. One of them was the fact that as a welfare organisation we had limited opportunities to influence owners in comparison, for example, with their vets. We all know the joke that people tend now to go to Dr. Google rather than call their vet when their horse is sick. But actually people reliably told us that they trusted their vet on strangles far more than any other source of information. We also worked very hard to bring about a sort of policy approach to this. So we engaged with industry leaders, so the British Equine Veterinary Association, and we had a symposium where we invited industry representative leaders in their sectors of the industry, where we basically chewed the fat and discussed the challenges around improved biosecurity. We increased people's knowledge about the disease, but more importantly, we discussed how they felt it was difficult or easier to get better biosecurity on their yards, at their events, or in their own horses. We also tapped into the fact that nowadays most of what we do, we live our lives through our digital devices. And actually, activism and mobilising horse owners can be quite challenging given that they want to spend as much time as possible with their horses. But they are also very enthused about communicating and sharing their experiences. And so we came up with a pledge which tapped into And not only the information we got from from the survey, but also we understood that there were a few specific things that would probably get people to take that step to action their contemplated behaviour. So we targeted people who had already had that raised awareness, and this came about because most of the people had experienced strangles either directly themselves or knew of people who'd experienced strangles, and they were motivated to avoid it happening to them or happening to them again. We also sensed that for a lot of people there was a commercial interest to have yards that actually had a biosecurity program, that they recognised that people were now starting to demand a screening program before horses came onto the yard, because their horse gets screened, they would hope that others would be screened and therefore their horse will be safe. And then we basically brought in the concept behind the nudge tactics, working on small little steps. So for example, if you sign the pledge, you get little bits of information, but not too much. And we give people little tips of ideas they can do, which help them to progressively change their behaviour and influence the behaviour of the people around them in the yards. And to date, we've had, I think, well over 400 people who've signed the pledge. I think we now have 135 yards where people have committed to improve biosecurity on their yard, and we now map those so that people can know where to bring their horse if they want to go to a yard with higher biosecurity. And then finally, I'm just going to touch on a project which I think is really important. Those who came to Brauwere in 2017 will have seen me refer to the Best in Show project that Andy brought about. So in the time since then, what Andy and her team have realised is that actually we need to move towards much more of a relational approach between us and the people we want to influence. If we're going to facilitate learning, we need to get open communication, because what we have to do is establish or repair trust between the welfare organisations and the travelling community. We basically incorporated a collaborative model where the learners, the people we want to influence, are actually the active participants. And so we now do videos where, rather than us being recorded, talking through things that affect the travelling community at Appleby Horse Fair, we actually have them do the talking for us. And this is unscripted, and this is actually led by them, usually them coming to us saying, I've seen what you're doing. For example, Martina never knew that the RSVCA got up very early every morning, put on wetsuits, and actually dived into the river to clear dangerous debris that could injure horses later on in the day. So I'm just going to play this video for you, and I hope that you'll see that this is not only a human behaviour change tool, it actually relates to learning theory and behaviour of horses.
I'm offended. Be like in the rain, and so catch up so well, health. If you've got a horse that you get, you've got a horse that like 5 years on the run, she's not saying on the run, but I want to ride, and when they come down, now all the horses are probably going to launch on the run. Mainly coming in to do all the guys, when you go around, it's quite shallow. There's a lot of get in. As soon as you stand on, it drops down a lot. There's one rock a lot of horses climb onto, and when they drop off, there's no footing there at all. So the horses go under in the panic, and the riders will pull on them out, and they'll end up coming back on the stand. That's when you start to get trouble. You're better off getting off and leaving it through so it knows what the footing is. Since the past 5 years, we've got a lot of safer since RSPCA being here. They come in before the fair, they take out all the rubbish, all the stuff that is harmful to horses, which is handy because there's a lot of people come in and they don't realise. But this is why I've got his boots on, just to protect his legs. So my top 3 things of staying careful in the river will be coming down the ramp, take it easy, so you can watch out where the footing is for the rocks and what have you. A lot of horses will cut the legs. It's best off to have the boot is. A lot of riders should be watchful for the horse. I've seen a lot of riders when the horse has put the head down, they're pulling the horse's head back up, and all the horse is doing is trying to look or even maybe have a drink because it's very hot. But once you get in, as long as you're on a horse that knows what it's doing, it's fine.
Okay, so hopefully the sound wasn't too bad. I got feedback there that the video wasn't that clear, but we can always show it to you again later on. If Katrina's got a copy of that slide that can run if anyone wants to sort of watch it, or you can go online and find it through our Redwings website. So really just to finish off, I think as a community, reputation scientists do need to evolve to understand the issues that are behind the problems that we as researchers and passionate advocates for animal welfare want to understand and address. Collaborating with other disciplines, groups and people is absolutely essential. We really need to just engage with our desired audience in a constructive and respectful way. It's vital that we avoid judgment, but that we develop an understanding which will often lead to a mutual recognition, respect, and often even friendships. And I think we need to co-create from the very outset of any project where we seek to improve horse welfare through research focused on equitation science. And I think, therefore, it's vital that we tackle the whole concept as a complete project. And you can see Scribble's opinion of me is enough for us to say thank you very much for listening, and hopefully I can now answer some questions if we have any time left.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Nick. Beautifully kept to time, everything worked. And thank you, Katrina, as well, for making that happen. So we've certainly got some time for questions. So if you'd like to raise your hands, if you could say who you are, where you're from, and then a microphone will find you. Please speak clearly into the microphone because we are trying to live stream this for people who can't be with us. So, there's the microphone. Right, so I've got one over here.
Jan Redwings, Denmark. Hello, Nick. Too bad you're not here. The beer tastes better when you're around.
Can I just check you can hear that? Nick, can you hear Jan?
No, I think if you could repeat it would be better. I can sort of hear, but not that well at the moment.
Okay. This is Jan Ladevik.
Yeah. In connection, you mentioned in connection with behavior change that it's important to define the goal you're aiming for. I learned many years ago in the behavior clinic that you start out first defining your point A, that's where you are at. What's the problem exactly? Is it the horse that is afraid of motorcycles, or is it actually the owner who is afraid that the horse will be afraid of the motorcycle? You have to define that as clearly as possible. The next step is that you have to define the goal. What are you aiming for? Do you want to reach the goal where the horse is no longer afraid of the motorcycle, or shouldn't you aim a little bit higher and make the horse even love the sound of motorcycles? Once you have point A, the starting point, and B, the goal, then it's much easier to plan the way between or from A to point B. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. So I think Jan was really not so much asking a question as leading you into perhaps just talking a little bit more about when you're trying to change behaviour, and this is from Jan's experience, particularly working with problem pets in a behaviour clinic setting.
And horses.
And horses. In that situation, what he was saying is that first of all you have to define what the problem is, which means I suspect taking quite a lot of behavioural history and trying to understand the world from the client's point of view, what they see as the problem. And then what the goal is going to be, and that's got to be an agreed goal. And that has to be very clear in order for a plan then to be put in place that might actually deal with the problem.
And I think that's really important. Can you just nod if you can hear me, because I'm muting the microphone to try and reduce feedback. But I think when we've seen some of the criticism in the past at IC's demo days, where maybe the horses have been under a certain amount of stress, that one of the important points that is easily missed is that if we're going to get people to engage with us as practitioners of learning theory and equitation science, that they need to go away feeling that they've got something out of it. So yes, we need to understand what their ambition is, what their goal is. And then I think we need to work towards giving them a bit of a win, and then take them on a journey where their goal and our goal for the horse ends up being the same. And this is something that I think some practitioners are very gifted at doing without any prompting, without any training, but others of us will probably need help to do that. And I think that's where collaborating with other groups who are specialists at this can really help us to get much more effective. So, for example, there's one of the videos on the YouTube channel, which is free to view, for the Human Behavior Change Foundation, where they talk about an analysis of why Cesar Millan is so successful in keeping a loyal following of dog owners. So despite the fact that he employs some really aversive training techniques, he's using very successful, maybe unconsciously using very successful human behavior change techniques, creating a relationship with a common goal. And I think that's what we could probably learn from him more than anything else, is how to engage with our horse owners.
Another question? Another question? We've got two of me in the room at the moment. Two of me in the room. Problem.
Thank you. Mark from Michael University. It's a bit funny to come all the way from the UK to ask a question to Nic, who's back in the UK. But anyway, what I was wondering about is how you make the link from having the facts from equitation science, so the work that we all do in our daily research, and translate that into something that taps into the emotions of the owners. How do you make the bridge between the two?
Thanks. So this is a question from Mark Gillard, who says hello, and he probably could have asked this of you when he was back in the UK, but anyway. He's asking you to explain from your point of view how you might make a link between the research, the facts that we have as equitation scientists, and translate those into something that taps into the emotions and connects with the people that we're trying to get this information to.
Thanks, Nat. I mean, I think it is a skill that some people do have, and it's probably watching them with their animal and having a conversation. And I think if you can level that sort of field where you are just seen as another one of them, that have a shared goal. And I think our work at Appleby has really built off the back of, one, we've handed out the rosettes as a way of showing them that we value the horses as much as they do. If we could pick a winner that they would have picked, we get double bonus points for being knowledgeable. And once you have that, you have a relationship and trust. And then from there, often it's about showing people that they could do. So in Martina's video there, the reduction in the amount of whipping of horses to get them into the river has come about as a large consequence of RSPCA inspectors being there and actually stopping people from doing it, just taking the whips off them and getting the police involved if somebody continued to hit a horse. But also by pointing to examples of best practice among some of the other guys in the river who could get their horse to swim without whipping it, and actually using peer pressure. So I think it all comes back down to showing that you have common ground where you're both passionate about the horse and you both want the same thing, which is that you love your horses, and then working out from there. And probably not, just like with horse training, shaping that journey in a way that's not too confronting for people.
Great. We have 1 minute remaining for a very quick question, if there's any. We've got one down in front here.
So Lena from the University of Guelph. I just wondered, going back to Lena from Guelph. And my question is, with court cases, can you comment on what the average time that they would take to prosecute an individual? And then if he has any thoughts on what that length of time is in proportion to the animal's life, and is that always how could we maybe speed them up? I don't know.
Next, so this is a question from Elena, who's a veterinarian here at the University of Guelph. She gave a very good presentation yesterday of her. Oh, well, she was chairing actually. She presented herself very well. She's interested very much in court cases and the average time taken within in the UK for cases that are taken to court to actually come to court and for any prosecutions to be made, and what the impact might be then on those animals in terms of the time taken and how things could be speeded up?
Yeah, that's certainly something we could discuss for an entire day. I think there's two things to be said. One, we've become more effective at making sure that we work in a way that the RSPCA and the police can use the information we provide in a way that the cases are more likely to succeed. That has meant that a good statement is often looked at by a defence lawyer, and actually they tell their client that they haven't got a leg to stand on, because quite often the people who claim that they are not guilty are way beyond any kind of rational assessment of their responsibility to the horse. The easy wins happen in the field. We don't have to take the horses away from the people. The second is that I think we need to review how we engage with the judicial system, and I have a project that I'm sort of working on at the moment where it's not really for us or the RSPCA to tell the judges that they don't understand horse welfare and that they shouldn't listen to the defence team. It's actually up to the lawyers to engage in that. And there's actually a group in the UK that started up, which is a foundation where animal lawyers, or lawyers that are interested in animal welfare, are working together. And I think groups like that might actually help us to improve, because what we all want is justice. And I think if we have a case going to court, we don't want it to be a miscarriage of justice, but we also don't want the process to be an abusive process. And I think that's where engaging with the legal world to try and get their help in getting the judiciary to understand the evidence we're putting forward. And I think the 5 domains model might be a big leap forward for us, because judges understand emotions and affective states. And hopefully this leads nicely to the work you and Hayley will do this afternoon, because I think if we can evidence that horses have subjective negative experiences to a judge, I don't think we need to be there for more than a couple of hours.
Great, thank you, Nick. So Nick, in appreciation of your wonderful talk and keeping us really interested, even though you're not here dancing around with your bright shirts on, we have decided, or the organisation here has decided, to donate to an amazing charity, the Brook Hospital for Animals, some money, and here is the certificate of donation I'm showing you now. And if you'd all like to put your hands together for Nick. Thank you. Okay, so thank you everybody, and I think now we have another one of these extremely exciting poster blitzes. So if we can have the poster blitz lights, who shall collect on my left here, then we'll run through these, and I think there's some voting slips being taken out to you now.